The ferry from Stockholm to Helsinki cut through the gray Baltic waters on a freezing morning in January 1944. Among the passengers huddled against the wind stood a woman who called herself Elsa Bergman, a Swedish Red Cross nurse traveling to Finland to assist with civilian medical relief. Her papers were impeccable, her Swedish flawless, and her story perfectly rehearsable. But Elsa Bergman didn't exist. The woman was actually Captain Sarah Winters of the British Special Operations Executive, and she was about to attempt one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the entire war. Winters was 32 years old, spoke 5 languages fluently, and had a photographic memory that had made her invaluable to British intelligence since 1941. She'd grown up in a diplomatic family, her father serving as a British consul in various European cities. By the time war broke out, she'd lived in Berlin, Vienna, Stockholm, and Helsinki. She knew these cities like most people knew their hometowns. More importantly, she understood the culture, the social dynamics, the unspoken rules that govern behavior in each place. The mission was born from desperation. By January 1944, it had become clear that Germany was developing new weapons technology that could change the course of the war. Intelligence reports spoke of rockets, jet aircraft, and other advanced systems being tested at secret facilities across occupied Europe. One of these facilities was believed to be in eastern Finland, where the Germans maintained a research station under an agreement with their Finnish allies. The British needed to know what was happening there, and they needed someone who could get close enough to find out. The problem was Finland's unique position in the war. The Finns weren't Nazi sympathizers. They were fighting their own war against the Soviet Union, and they'd accepted German assistance out of necessity rather than ideology. This made Finland a complex intelligence environment. The country wasn't occupied like France or Norway. It was an independent nation with its own government and military. British agents couldn't simply parachute in and expect help from a resistance movement, because there wasn't one. Any operation in Finland required subtlety and an understanding of the delicate political situation. Winters had volunteered for the mission despite knowing the odds. If caught, she couldn't expect any protection. Britain and Finland weren't technically at war, but they weren't friends either. The Finns had expelled British diplomats in 1941, and any British spy caught on Finnish soil would likely be handed over to the Germans. There would be no prisoner exchange, no diplomatic intervention. She would simply disappear. The ferry docked in Helsinki just before noon. Winters moved through customs with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. The Finnish officer barely glanced at her papers before stamping them and waving her through. The Swedish Red Cross had genuine operations in Finland, providing medical supplies and humanitarian assistance. Winters' cover was designed to blend into this real organization without actually being part of it, a technique called shadow affiliation that gave her legitimacy without creating a paper trail that could be checked too closely. Helsinki in January was a city holding its breath. The war with the Soviet Union had entered a strange quiet phase, with both sides exhausted after years of fighting. But everyone knew it couldn't last. The Soviets were winning on every front, pushing the Germans back toward Berlin. Eventually, they would turn their full attention back to Finland, and when they did, the small Nordic nation would face impossible choices. Winters spent her first 3 days establishing her cover. She visited a hospital where Swedish Red Cross personnel actually worked, introducing herself and explaining that she was conducting an independent assessment of medical needs in outlying areas. The story was designed to give her freedom of movement while avoiding too much direct contact with Real Red Cross officials who might ask uncomfortable questions. She rented a small apartment in the Kamppi district, bought groceries, attended a church service. She became part of the city's background, just another foreign aid worker among the many who had come to help. On the 4th day, she made contact with a local asset, a Finnish railway official named Mikko Virtanen. Virtanen wasn't a spy in any traditional sense. He was a patriot who loved his country and hated what the war had done to it. He'd been recruited by British intelligence through a complex chain of intermediaries, and he didn't know Winters' real identity or mission. He knew only that he was to help a Swedish nurse travel east and asked no questions about why. They met in a cafe near the railway station, a busy place where conversations were lost in the clatter of cups and the hiss of the espresso machine. Virtanen was in his 50s, with tired eyes and the cautious manner of a man who'd survived 3 years of war by not taking unnecessary risks. "You want to go to La Penranta?" he asked in Swedish, keeping his voice low. "That's near the border. They're still fighting in that region." "I'm assessing medical facilities in border areas," Winters replied, sticking to her cover. "The Red Cross needs to know where supplies are most needed." Virtanen studied her for a long moment. "You'll need travel permits. The Germans control movement in the eastern regions. They're very particular about who goes where." "Can you arrange it?" "Perhaps, but it will take time. A week, maybe more. And it will cost money. Officials need to be encouraged to process paperwork quickly." Winters had expected this. She passed him an envelope under the table, thick with Finnish marks. Virtanen pocketed it without counting. "I'll see what I can do. Come back in 3 days." Those 3 days were among the longest of Winter's life. Waiting was always the hardest part of intelligence work. She filled the time maintaining her cover, visiting hospitals, writing reports that no one would ever read. She also began mapping the city's German presence. There were Wehrmacht officers everywhere, their gray-green uniforms standing out among the Finnish soldiers' different shade of gray. The Germans moved with the confidence of men who owned the place, which in a sense they did. Finland might be independent, but it depended on German weapons, fuel, and food. That dependence gave Berlin enormous leverage. On the evening of the 3rd day, Winters returned to the cafe. Virtanen was already there, a newspaper spread in front of him. He didn't look up as she sat down. "Your papers are ready," he said quietly. "But there's a problem. The Germans have closed the direct route to La Penranta. There's been partisan activity, Soviet saboteurs crossing the border. Everything going east is being searched thoroughly." "How thoroughly?" "Very. They're checking every bag, questioning every traveler. If you're carrying anything you shouldn't be, they'll find it." Winters had anticipated searches, but this was worse than expected. She carried several items that would be hard to explain. A miniature camera disguised as a lipstick case. A code book concealed in the lining of her suitcase. A cyanide pill sewn into her coat collar in case of capture. None of these could survive a thorough search. "Is there another way?" she asked. Virtanen folded his newspaper with deliberate care. "There's a supply train leaving tomorrow morning. Medical supplies, mostly. Heading to field hospitals near the front. The Germans don't search those trains as carefully because they're carrying their own cargo. If you were on that train, as a Red Cross nurse inspecting the medical supplies in transit, you might have an easier time. Can you get me on that train? It's already arranged, but you'll have to actually inspect the supplies. There will be a German medical officer traveling with the train. He'll expect you to know what you're talking about." This was both a risk and an opportunity. It would give her cover story more authenticity, but it also meant close contact with a German officer for several hours. Any mistake could be fatal. "I can handle it," Winters said. The next morning, she arrived at the railway yard before dawn. The train was a long line of freight cars, some marked with red crosses, others with Wehrmacht insignia. Soldiers moved in the half-light, loading crates and checking manifests. Winters found the medical cars and introduced herself to the German officer in charge, a Hauptmann named Klaus Weber. Weber was around 40, with the professional manner of career military medical officer. He looked at her papers with more attention than the Finnish customs official had, but eventually nodded. "Fräulein Bergman, welcome. I'm told you'll be inspecting our medical supplies. I hope you find everything in order. We take great care with these shipments." "I'm sure you do, Hauptmann. The Red Cross simply wants to ensure that supplies are reaching civilian populations as well as military personnel. Of course, though in a war zone, the distinction can be difficult to maintain. Come, I'll show you what we're carrying." They spent the next hour going through the freight cars. Weber was thorough and professional, explaining the contents of each crate, the intended destinations, the systems for tracking and distributing supplies. Winters took notes, asked intelligent questions, and used the opportunity to observe everything she could. The train wasn't just carrying medical supplies. Several cars at the back contained military equipment under tarps. She couldn't see what exactly, but the way the soldiers guarded those cars suggested something important. The train departed at 8, rolling slowly east through forests heavy with snow. Winters and Weber sat in a passenger car that had been attached to the freight train, along with a few other officers and officials. The landscape outside was beautiful in a harsh way, endless white punctuated by dark trees. It was easy to forget that this peaceful-looking wilderness was a war zone where men died in the cold and dark. Weber proved to be a talkative companion. He spoke about his work, his frustration with supply shortages, his hope that the war would end soon. He didn't seem to be fishing for information, just a tired man making conversation during a long journey. Winters encouraged him carefully, asking questions that seemed natural but steered the conversation toward useful topics. "You must travel this route often," she said, "once or twice a month. More lately. There's been increased activity in the region. New facilities opening, more personnel arriving. It keeps us busy." "New facilities? Medical facilities?" "Some medical, yes, but also research installations. The Reich is developing new technologies. Important work, very secret. I don't know the details, of course. That's above my level. But I see the resources being devoted to it, so it must be significant." This was exactly the kind of information Winters needed, but she had to be careful not to show too much interest. It must be challenging, providing medical support in such remote areas. "It is, especially at the research station near La Penranta. It's quite isolated, and the scientists there are very particular about their working conditions. They complain constantly about everything." Winters smiled sympathetically. "Scientists are the same everywhere, I think. Always focused on their work to the exclusion of practical matters." Weber laughed. "Exactly so. Though I suppose we should be grateful. If their work helps end this war sooner, a few complaints are worth tolerating." The conversation continued, touching on various topics, but Winters had what she needed. There was a research facility near La Penranta. It was important enough to receive regular supply shipments, and it involved scientists working on classified technology. The pieces were fitting together. The train reached La Penranta in the late afternoon. The town was smaller than Helsinki, with a frontier atmosphere. German and Finnish soldiers mixed in the streets, and there was a visible military presence everywhere. The research facility Weber had mentioned wasn't visible from the town, which meant it was probably some distance away, hidden in the forest. Winters checked into a small hotel, using her cover story about assessing medical needs in the region. The hotel owner was suspicious of all strangers, a reasonable attitude in a border town, but her papers satisfied him. She spent the evening in her room, reviewing what she'd learned and planning her next steps. The challenge now was locating the exact position of the research facility. She couldn't simply ask directions without arousing suspicion. She needed to find it through careful observation and inference. Over the next 2 days, she explored the town and surrounding area, posing as a nurse familiarizing herself with the region. She noted the patterns of military traffic, the roads that seemed to carry more vehicles than others, the directions from which supply trucks arrived and departed. On the 3rd day, she made a breakthrough. A supply truck with German markings stopped at a fuel depot on the edge of town. The driver got out to smoke a cigarette while the fuel was being pumped. Winters, walking past as if on her way somewhere else, overheard him complaining to the attendant. 20 kilometers on that forest road every day, twice a day." The driver grumbled in German. "My back is killing me. Those scientists better be inventing something that ends this war, because I can't take much more of that drive." 20 kilometers on a forest road. Winters studied her map that evening. There was only one road leading northeast from La Penranta into the deep forest, a rough track that logging companies had used before the war. If the facility was 20 kilometers along that road, it would be well hidden in the wilderness, far from prying eyes. But knowing where the facility was located wasn't enough. Winters needed to know what was happening there. What kind of research? What stage of development? How many personnel? What were the security arrangements? This information couldn't be gathered from a distance. She would have to get closer. The problem was access. The forest road would be guarded, and a Swedish nurse had no conceivable reason to be wandering around in the wilderness near a secret German research station. She needed a different approach. The solution came from an unexpected source. At the hotel, she befriended a local woman named Lisa who worked in the kitchen. Lisa was young, perhaps 20, and like many Finns, she had conflicted feelings about the German presence. The Germans were allies against the Soviets, but they were also arrogant foreigners who treated Finland like occupied territory. Over several conversations, Winters learned that Lisa's brother worked at a logging camp in the forest. The camp had been there since before the war, and it continued operating because the Germans needed timber for construction. The camp was about 15 kilometers northeast of town, along the same road that led to the research facility. The loggers say the Germans built something deeper in the forest. Lisa told her one evening. They won't say what it is, but there are always military trucks on the road, and soldiers who tell the loggers to stay away from certain areas. Your brother must see a lot going back and forth, Winters said carefully. He doesn't talk about it much. The Germans warned everyone that loose talk could mean trouble. But yes, he sees things. It bothers him, I think. Before the war, those forests were free. Now there are fences and guards and secrets. An idea formed in Winters' mind. I need to inspect the medical facilities at the logging camps. It's part of my assessment for the Red Cross. Do you think your brother could help me get there? Lisa looked uncertain. The camps don't have much in the way of medical facilities. Just first aid supplies, really. All the more reason to document it. The Red Cross needs to know where resources are lacking. It took another day of careful persuasion, but eventually Lisa agreed to introduce Winters to her brother. His name was Antti, a tall man in his 30s with the weathered look of someone who worked outdoors. He was suspicious at first, but Winters' cover story was solid, and she had the papers to back it up. More importantly, she paid well for his help. Antti agreed to take her to the logging camp, which would give her a legitimate reason to be on the forest road. From there, she would have to improvise. The camp was a collection of rough wooden buildings in a clearing, surrounded by stacks of cut timber. About 40 men worked there, a mix of Finnish civilians and workers from other countries. The conditions were harsh, but not as bad as some labor camps Winters had heard about. She spent a day at the camp, inspecting the modest medical supplies and talking to the workers. She played her role perfectly, a concerned nurse documenting needs and making recommendations. But all the while, she was observing, noting the military traffic on the road, the timing of patrols, the apparent security arrangements. As evening approached, she asked Antti about the road beyond the camp. What's farther up the road? More logging operations. He shook his head. Nothing. The road continues for a few more kilometers. Then there's a checkpoint. Germans. No one is allowed past without authorization. Beyond that, we don't know. The forest is dense there, old growth. Whatever they built, it's well hidden. Have you ever gone past a checkpoint? Once, by accident. I was tracking a wounded deer and didn't realize I'd gone too far. The guards weren't happy. They escorted me back and made it clear that if it happened again, there would be consequences. That night, Winters made her decision. She couldn't get past the checkpoint through official means, and trying to bluff her way through would be too risky. She would have to go around it, through the forest itself. It was dangerous. The winter forest was unforgiving, and if she got lost or injured, she would likely die of exposure before anyone found her. But it was the only way to complete her mission. She spent the next day preparing. She borrowed cold weather gear from the logging camp, claiming she wanted to take photographs of the forest for her report. She studied maps and talked to the loggers about the terrain, learning which areas were passable and which were deadly. She packed a small rucksack with supplies, food, water, a compass, matches, a knife, and hidden in the lining of her coat, her miniature camera. At dawn the following day, she set out. She told Auntie she was hiking in the forest near the camp to photograph winter conditions for the Red Cross. He thought she was crazy to go out in such cold, but he didn't try to stop her. That was one advantage of being a foreign woman in a remote area. People assumed you didn't know what you were doing and left you alone. Winters hiked east from the camp, paralleling the road but staying deep enough in the forest to avoid being seen. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the cold was intense. Her breath froze in the air, and her fingers grew numb despite her gloves. But she pushed on, using her compass and the position of the sun to navigate. After 3 hours of difficult hiking, she began to see signs of human activity. The forest showed marks of recent clearing, and she could hear distant sounds of machinery. She moved more carefully now, conscious that there might be patrols. The Germans wouldn't expect anyone to approach through the forest in winter, but they weren't stupid. There would be some security. Then she saw it. Through the trees, a compound came into view. It was larger than she'd expected. A cluster of buildings, surrounded by a wire fence. Guard towers stood at the corners, and she could see sentries moving along the perimeter. Several vehicles were parked near the main building, and smoke rose from chimneys. This was it. The secret research facility. Winters found a position on a small ridge overlooking the compound, screened by trees, but with a clear view of the facility. She took out her camera and began photographing everything she could see. The layout of the buildings, the positions of the guard towers, the types of vehicles, the antennas and power lines that suggested communications equipment. She worked quickly but carefully, knowing that each photograph represented vital intelligence. Then something unexpected happened. A truck arrived at the compound gates, and soldiers began unloading equipment. Even from a distance, Winters could see that it wasn't ordinary military cargo. There were cylindrical objects, carefully crated, that looked like they might be components of rockets or missiles. There were also what appeared to be navigation instruments, sophisticated equipment that suggested guidance systems. This was more significant than she'd hoped. The Germans weren't just conducting theoretical research here. They were assembling actual weapons, probably for testing. This facility was part of the Reich's effort to develop the wonder weapons that propaganda kept promising. If these weapons became operational, they could change the strategic balance of the war. Winters photographed everything, using an entire roll of film. She knew the photographs alone wouldn't tell the whole story, but they would give British intelligence analysts something concrete to work with. Combined with her observations and the information she'd gathered from Weber and others, it would be enough to paint a clear picture of what was happening here. As she prepared to leave, disaster struck. A patrol emerged from the trees below her position, 2 soldiers with a dog. They weren't heading toward her. They were simply making rounds, but the dog had caught a scent. It began pulling toward her position, barking urgently. The soldiers followed, calling out in German. Winters didn't wait to be found. She retreated deeper into the forest, moving as quickly as the deep snow allowed. Behind her, she heard more shouts, and the dog's barking grew closer. They were following her tracks in the snow, and there was no way to hide them. She ran, her lungs burning in the cold air, branches tearing at her clothes. The forest seemed endless, and every direction looked the same. She could hear the patrol behind her, closer now. The dog was gaining. In minutes, they would have her. Then the terrain dropped away in front of her. A ravine, steep and deep, its bottom hidden by snow. There was no way around, and no time to find another path. The patrol was almost upon her. Winters made a split-second decision. She jumped. The drop was farther than she'd thought, and she hit hard, rolling down the steep slope in a tangle of snow and branches. She felt something in her ankle give way with a sharp crack of pain. When she finally stopped rolling, she was at the bottom of the ravine, buried in snow, unable to move. Above, she heard the soldiers reach the edge. There was shouting, confusion. The dog was barking frantically. They could see her tracks leading to the edge, but the ravine was steep and dangerous. After several minutes of discussion, the soldiers moved away, probably going to find a safer way down or to call for reinforcements. Winters forced herself to move despite the pain in her ankle. She had to get away from this spot before they returned with more men. She crawled along the bottom of the ravine, using her arms to pull herself through the snow. Every movement was agony, but stopping meant capture, and capture meant death. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, she found a place where the ravine sides were less steep. She pulled herself up, using tree roots and sheer determination. When she finally reached level ground, she was exhausted, freezing, and in tremendous pain. But she was still free. She forced herself to orient using her compass. The logging camp was southwest. If she could reach it, she might survive. If she couldn't, she would freeze to death in the forest. It was that simple. The journey back was a nightmare. Her ankle wouldn't support her weight, so she had to half-crawl, half-drag herself through the snow. The cold was becoming dangerous. She could feel her extremities going numb. Her thoughts began to wander, a sign of hypothermia. She knew she had to keep moving, but her body wanted to stop, to rest, to sleep. When Annie found her 3 hours later, she was barely conscious. He'd gone looking when she didn't return by afternoon, following her tracks through the forest. He carried her back to the camp, his face grim with concern. The loggers wrapped her in blankets, gave her hot soup, splinted her ankle. They asked no questions. In Finland in wartime, it was safer not to know too much. Winter stayed at the camp for 2 days, recovering enough strength to travel. Her ankle was badly sprained, possibly fractured, but she couldn't risk seeing a German military doctor. Andy arranged for a truck to take her back to Lappeenranta, claiming she'd injured herself photographing the forest. The story was thin, but no one challenged it too hard. From Lappeenranta, Winters made her way back to Helsinki, traveling on regular trains and showing her papers at checkpoints. She was just another Red Cross nurse returning from the field, limping from an accident. The German officers who checked her papers were polite and incurious. Why would they suspect this injured Swedish woman of being a British spy? In Helsinki, she spent 3 more days maintaining her cover, visiting hospitals, writing her fake report. The film from her camera was hidden in a hollowed-out tube of medical ointment, indistinguishable from ordinary medical supplies. When she finally boarded the ferry back to Stockholm, she allowed herself to believe she might actually make it. The Stockholm ferry docked in the morning. Swedish customs waved her through without searching her bags. She took a taxi to a safe house in the diplomatic quarter, where a British intelligence officer was waiting. She handed over the film, debriefed for 6 hours, and then collapsed into sleep that lasted 15 hours. The photographs and intelligence Winters provided proved invaluable. The facility she discovered was indeed part of Germany's rocket weapons program, specifically working on guidance systems for the W/2 rockets that would later terrorize London. Her intelligence allowed the RAF to target the facility in a bombing raid 3 weeks later, setting back the program by several months. Winters received a commendation that would remain classified for 50 years. Her ankle healed, though it always bothered her in cold weather, a permanent reminder of that day in the Finnish forest. She continued working for British intelligence throughout the war, completing several more missions, though none quite as harrowing as her time in Finland. After the war, she wrote a memoir that was immediately classified by the British government. It wouldn't be published until 2001. Long after the Cold War had ended and most of the people involved were dead. By then, she was an old woman, living quietly in Cornwall, bothered by journalists who wanted to interview the famous spy. She rarely gave interviews. When she did, people always asked her the same question. Had she been afraid? The answer was always yes. Fear was part of the job, something you learned to carry with you, to function despite. The real question wasn't whether you were afraid, but whether you could act anyway, whether you could push yourself beyond what seemed possible because the mission required it. The intelligence war in Finland represented a unique challenge in World War II. It required operating in a technically neutral country that was aligned with Germany out of necessity rather than ideology. Success depended on cultural understanding, language skills, and the ability to blend into complex social environments. Winter's mission showed how a single operative, properly trained and supported, could gather intelligence that changed the course of military operations. The research facility near La Penranta was one small part of Germany's massive weapons development program, but every piece of that program mattered. Disrupting the guidance system development delayed the V2 program, which meant fewer rockets falling on London, which meant lives saved. In intelligence work, the connection between action and outcome isn't always clear, but sometimes it is. Winters knew that her photographs had made a difference, that her terrible journey through the winter forest had been worth it. The shadow operations of World War II took many forms. Some involved sabotage and guerrilla warfare. Others focused on intelligence gathering, on the patient work of observation and documentation. Winter's mission was the latter type, unglamorous but essential. She didn't blow up bridges or assassinate enemy officers. She took photographs and asked careful questions. But in the end, information was the most powerful weapon of all. If you found this story of intelligence operations in the frozen north compelling, subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of World War II shadow operations. These missions took extraordinary courage and skill, and the people who carried them out deserve to be remembered. The war was won not just on battlefields, but in the shadows, by agents like Sarah Winters, who risked everything to gather the intelligence that commanders needed to make critical decisions. Their stories are part of history, part of the larger story of how the Allied victory was achieved one dangerous mission at a time.